Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation with Swapna Reddy. We're going to give it a second while everyone joins us from the waiting room, and then we'll just dive in. Hey, Swapna, thanks for making time again to join us.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Right. All right, let's give it maybe a few more seconds. Looks like folks are still joining. Great. All right, well, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's Welcome Change Conversation, where we hear from social entrepreneurs about what works, what's next, and why they're hopeful. So good afternoon again, and welcome, Swapna. Just for context, there are currently 3.5 million asylum seekers in the world. In 2019, about 35,000 individuals were granted asylum in the US. The asylum system, which has always been connected to world events and US priorities, has become an issue of public debate in an unprecedented way. And while the law and the politics remain a complex and entangled web, so often the human experience, which is so central to this, gets lost. So again, my name is Manmeet Mehta. I'm with the Ashoka team, and we are privileged to be joined by Ashoka Fellow Swapna Reddy. We're going to talk to her for the next 30 minutes about her innovation and how she's reshaping the asylum seekers' experience and redesigning the system to work better. We're going to talk about what's been happening and, most importantly, what she's hopeful about for the future. So some quick housekeeping as we dive in. There's going to be a Q&A option, so please share your questions, your comments in the Q&A function of Zoom. Swapna and I will chat for about the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we'll try to get to your questions before we wrap. We've only got 30 minutes today, so let's dive in. Swapna, take us back to the basics for one quick minute. Who is an asylum seeker and how are they different from a refugee?
Sure, it's a pretty technical distinction. A refugee is somebody, we'll use the US system. A refugee is someone who is seeking protection in the United States, but applies for that protection while they're still outside the borders of the United States. An asylum seeker is somebody who has made it into the United States or presented themselves at the US border already and is asking for protection while physically here. But it's the same group of people in the sense of the same issues causing people to flee harm and danger, the same definition that they need to meet in order to win. It's just a question of where they are when they're going through the process.
And so why is our asylum system broken, and where does ASAP and your work come in there?
Sure, I think historically, the asylum system hasn't functioned always at its best. It's hard. It's a hard logistical situation to try to make sure that people are treated from many different cultures are treated humanely and given a real chance to seek protection in the United States. More recently, I think the asylum system is broken because that's the goal. I think it's been the goal to break the system in the last few years. And I think the asylum system is more broken than it has ever been as a result of that.
And what were some of these, I mean, there's the by design piece, and then there are the other components. And where did you see an opportunity for innovation that led you to launch ASAP?
Sure. You know, my co-founders and I started ASAP a little over 5 years ago. In the previous administration, at that time, we had gone down to volunteer in what was then the nation's largest immigration detention facility, built to hold 2,400 women and children at once. And we went down there just to volunteer, actually to help another nonprofit with their work on the ground in the detention center. And while we were there, we met a woman named Suni Rodriguez, who does not use anonymity because she's a pretty powerful activist and organizer. And she was being forced to go to trial while she had been detained. She'd been detained for over 4 months with her then 7-year-old son. And we helped Suni at trial, and she won her case. We provided legal services to her. And whereas almost anyone else would have celebrated in response to that moment, being released from detention with your child after more than 4 months in jail, she actually turned to us and said, you know, I've been organizing other women in this detention center. I've been organizing women to teach them how to mother. not to teach them, but so they could work collectively to learn how to mother in like really difficult situations. And she knew the people who would be getting forced to go to trial every week after hers. And so instead of celebrate her release, she advocated for us to figure out ways to serve the other women who would be going to trial after that. And so kind of following SUNY's lead, from that point on, we decided to try to figure out how we could offer legal services to asylum seekers in really difficult conditions on really rapid timelines. And also following SUNY's lead, we decided to figure out how we could keep asylum seekers, kind of create the conditions for them to be in communication with each other, because the whole reason that ASAP exists is because of SUNY, an asylum seeker, advocating on behalf of other asylum seekers. And so we saw the power in asylum seekers collectively organizing and asking for what they needed, and wanted to make sure that was a core part of our model as well.
That's fascinating. And for our listeners, when we're talking about ASAP, we are talking about, it stands for?
Yeah, we're the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project, ASAP.
Yeah. And this connection, it's been referred to as crisis lawyering, and this rapid connection to legal services is immensely powerful on two levels. At one level, it increases the chances. I was reading a study that an asylum seeker who has legal support is 5 times more likely to be granted asylum in an immigration court than one who doesn't. And like you're saying, it provides an ability for asylum seekers to advocate on their behalf and on behalf of others. Just digging deeper into that, take us on a quick journey on what the experience is like for someone who arrives at the US border seeking asylum, and where does ASAP start to meet them?
Sure. Historically and by law, when an asylum seeker presents themselves at the US border and asks for asylum, they are supposed to be let into the country. And then their immigration proceedings should start from inside the borders of the US. Right now, during this administration, has been kind of a first ever historical shift where asylum seekers are being forced to wait in kind of tent camps on the Mexican side of the Mexico-US border after kind of asking to seek asylum in the US. So ASAP's interaction with asylum seekers actually starts now, increasingly on the Mexican side of the Mexico-US border, but wherever it is that kind of people find themselves kind of seeking asylum, like that's where our first contact with someone might be. From that point, asylum seekers are often given a preliminary interview where they have to meet a threshold that they have credible fear. And if they meet that threshold, then they're put into full-fledged immigration court proceedings where they kind of get a hearing, and there's an opposing, even if they don't have an attorney, there is an attorney who opposes their case, and they go before an administrative employee who's like a judge. And so it looks like a pretty typical, what you might think of like a trial procedure, which can be pretty hostile, even though the asylum seeker often is a non-native English speaker, a non-English speaker at all, doesn't have any legal background or knowledge of US law. So it's a pretty difficult process, and our courts are really backlogged, and COVID has not made things easier. So a lot of times people, it can be many years, 5 years before they're getting any resolution on their case. And during that time, asylum seekers typically don't qualify for the vast majority of public benefits and other things in the safety net. So it's a really difficult, long, and arduous process for asylum seekers that individuals are frankly usually only willing to undertake because they are genuinely pretty terrified of what their other option is. It's not a very desirable process to be a part of voluntarily.
It sounds like that's a pretty critical and important gap that you're meeting with them in this process. And in line with that, it's been interesting to see you've shared that you're on an incredible growth journey in this year. And in fact, your member base, all asylum seekers, have grown from 5,000 to 20,000 in just 2 months. And you're expecting to hit a 50,000 member mark. What's happening? How did this happen?
Sure. So I was just talking about how long and drawn out the process can be for an asylum seeker, even if they are going to win their case, it often takes 5 years to do so. And the one thing that asylum seekers are able to do to support their families during that time is work legally in the United States when their case has been pending for a certain amount of time. That has historically been the case. That if the government takes a long time to process a case, that asylum seekers are allowed to work to support their families until the government can reach an outcome. In this year, basically a rule change was passed that made it actually functionally impossible for asylum seekers to work while their proceedings were pending, which gave asylum seekers basically no way to support their families, even though the timelines of court cases are getting longer and longer and longer due to the pandemic and other issues. And so our members voted to challenge these rules that would make it very difficult, if not impossible, for asylum seekers to work in the United States. A federal judge ruled with them, agreed with our members, and said, this is not a reasonable kind of rule. This was not passed in a reasonable way, and so we need to. This rule does not apply to ASAP members, and it doesn't apply to members of CASA, one other organization. But all other asylum seekers are subject to a pretty harsh rule that's making it impossible for them to work legally in the United States. As a result, we're getting thousands of membership inquiries a week because becoming a member of ASAP is a way to work legally in the US for a huge number of people in the United States. And it's exactly the set of people we've always welcomed. We've always been trying to build a very large, inclusive national community of asylum seekers from everywhere in the world. And so while we wish, asylum seekers could work legally in the United States without having to become our members, we're also thrilled to have more asylum seekers in kind of in a membership organized to be able to challenge the system than ever before. And so, yeah, we've grown from 5,000 to 20,000 members pretty quickly as a result of this court decision and landscape, and that will probably continue for the months to come.
One of the interesting things in this story is that we're seeing the role of the asylum seeker shift from being quiet, passive bystanders and trying to just show up whenever they can, to being active advocates with a voice and championing their ability to support themselves. And you just said your members voted vehemently for this action. What do you think has caused that pivot?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a narrative pivot, not like a action pivot, in the sense that I think who but asylum seekers are like pretty brave advocates of, like, the average asylum seeker is somebody who traveled like hundreds or thousands of miles across a bunch of like navigating a bunch of unknown systems, like to better the lives of themselves or their family or their community. Like they're almost like if you were going to pick any like bravest, most risk-taking, bold, innovating set of people, it would probably be asylum seekers or refugees who are like really taking some matters into their own hand and trying to like fix a situation. So I think it's more like a narrative shift of people recognizing that that this is a set of people who really know how to change things and really know how to get things done. That's like quite literally what's brought them into the situation that they're in. And so I think one great example of that is that our asylum seekers not only voted to challenge these rules that would make it impossible for asylum seekers to work, but they challenged it in a pretty bold way. They brought an argument saying the acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security does not have actually any valid, doesn't have authority of that office because he wasn't correctly confirmed. And so not only are these rules not legitimate, but nothing that the DHS secretary has been doing has been legitimate because he was not lawfully appointed. And so that's a pretty bold step to take for a group of people who are in a pretty insecure position, but is in line with the kind of bravery and courage that it takes to be an asylum seeker in the first place. And that choice has been pretty amazing, has had pretty amazing consequences. It was able to be a major reason that they won on a preliminary basis in this work permit case. And it also ended up being then kind of like as a domino effect, a major reason that others were able to push back fees that would have increased for green card holders and to naturalize. And also it was used to push back against new DACA procedures that would have made it very difficult for dreamers to get status in the United States. So asylum seekers have been leading the way and will continue to lead the way in a lot of when it comes to kind of bravery and courage and innovation, but it's nice that it's starting to be recognized.
And it's just an incredibly powerful story. And as you know, it's something that is very core to Ashoka's work in our belief that everyone has the ability to be a change maker and shape their future. And it's just been incredible to hear the details from you. But talking about change makers and change making journeys, you yourself have had a really interesting journey. You're a scientist, you've studied math, you've written AI code, and then you sort of fast forward to 2015, you're in law school training to be a lawyer, and you start ASAP. Did you anticipate this winding road that's brought you to this moment?
No, definitely not. I am a child of immigrants. I have 3 brothers. For various reasons, my brothers and I were sometimes raised together, sometimes raised across continents, like a story that seems extreme to like someone who's been able to stably live in the United States under one household their whole life, but is actually pretty typical of the stories that a lot of our members have, which are being able to not keep all children together all the time as like immigration journeys are happening, and trying to like do your best to unite households over time. And so I think that I always knew I wanted to do something in the space of inequality and inequality of opportunity and something international, and because it's so core to my family's story. But in terms of skills, I think I just kind of like studied what was interesting in college, and it was really interesting to study theoretical math and theoretical computer science and artificial intelligence stuff, but I was always kind of along the way using it, applying it to anti-poverty and like inequality related fields. After college, I worked in that space for a while, and at some point just kind of wanted to work more directly for people, not like just study and analyze societal problems, but kind of like solve problems people were like directly asking to be solved. And that's not a knock on the other world. I actually still think it's really fascinating, and I'm really glad I got to work in it. But just made me want to work in kind of a client relationship and in a direct service capacity. And so I made a shift into law as a result of that, which was a big shift, and left kind of all the skills behind, and worked directly with hundreds of immigrants as legal clients, civil rights and criminal justice related legal services for a while. And in law school, had the great fortune of meeting 3 other people who kind of, we all just like set off to be volunteers who were doing something useful, and then it grew into an entire organization that's been our full-time work, all 4 of us, and now a staff of 16 to do this work since then. But it has, in this moment, been very useful that I've had those technical skills in a way that was unexpected, because in order to be scaling our systems very rapidly and onboarding thousands of people a year, I've needed to know how to code, how to build technical systems, like what the constraints are, what's realistic, et cetera. So that's been nice that those skills were not in vain from before, but certainly.
Well, the dots connect eventually. Well, so just pausing on that for a minute, you launched a startup about 5 years ago. You're growing an organization, you're at an incredible growth moment. All of this is hard work enough. The working in the asylum system is also challenging in many other levels. You're dealing with human beings whose lives are deeply impacted by abstract decisions. How do you find and sustain your energy? What keeps you going?
I actually have felt pretty lucky, honestly, in these recent years, that it's like my full-time job to address the things that everyone is feeling. Like I know that a lot of people in the United States are feeling like they wish they could do more or something. I actually feel like it feels like a pretty huge privilege that it's like my paid job to fight back against the things that are some of the things that are just like the most pressing, most devastating things happening in the country. So I think that it sustains me that I get to do so more sustainably than some other people, that I get paid for my activism. I think that it also, I think, there are a bunch of assumptions we made when we were creating this organization, kind of to deal with the worst case scenario, and then the worst case scenario became the status quo. And I think that it's also been pretty amazing to be able to see kind of like that work be useful in so many contexts for so many people, and to be able to provide technical assistance and support to other organizations that are just now for the first time having to figure out how to do everything remotely, how to never meet your clients, how to work with people across country borders because now they're stuck there, how to build a system that is robust to the loss changing pretty radically every week or something. And so I think it's also been a moment of reflection of like quite how much we've had to learn in the last few years that's now useful to share with other people. So it's actually been it is difficult, but I feel like the things that are very negative about this moment have changed less for ASAP than other organizations. And we're more in a position to kind of like, we might have been like 2 years or 3 years ahead and like how hard it is to do some of this kind of stuff. And so we're now more in a position to share, and that's been really fulfilling. And I feel pretty lucky that this is our job. And also the 3 people I co-founded this organization with we're all still here. And I cannot speak more strongly about how valuable it is to have like a support network and to have backup and to have room as like an entrepreneur and a founder to like be human, because there are other people who can back up and take your space. And so I think another key part of my sustainability is having some other people that I can rely on so much. And I'm sure hopefully everyone has that on their team or is looking for it.
And as we look past the year that this has been into 2021, where we have a new administration taking office, what is the biggest change that you would like to see from this new administration?
I mean, I would love to see an administration who thinks that the fact that there are 20,000 asylum seekers kind of acting collectively and want something as like a positive, like, oh, great, like that is a priority. Now we can like that would see it as an asset that asylum seekers are organized and able to articulate a set of issues with the asylum system and how to fix them. That's kind of my biggest hope for a new administration or any administration, is that they can recognize the immense value that asylum seekers are bringing to the table in terms of like, who better to fix a system that is pretty objectively destroyed than 20 or 50,000 asylum seekers working in concert. So that's my hope for the next year.
That's quite a powerful vision. And I want to raise this question that Jane Liu has posted, which is sort of related. Jane is also an Ashoka Fellow and she's the founder of Upwardly Global. And she asks that she would love to hear your vision for a way the US could handle asylum cases if you could design the process from scratch. And that's a big question. So maybe if there is one element that you feel is rather key that you could redesign, including from a policy side, what would that be?
Yeah, I do find those questions really hard because there's always some kind of constraints, some implied constraints that are unstated about what's possible. But in a dream world, you could just fix the consenting conditions so people wouldn't have to flee their country in the first place unless they actually wanted to. But I think probably one lower hanging fruit way to fix the system is to just, there's so much individual adjudication, like such a hostile process that each asylum seeker, we're talking about tens of thousands of people, each having to have a very intense trial where in order to win, you have to produce hundreds of pages of documentation and get people, your loved ones, to testify about how hard things have been for you and to relive all these traumatic experiences in a pretty harsh, antagonistic way. Like, I think one lower hanging fruit thing is just like trying to have as few cases decided through kind of antagonistic, hyper individualized process as possible, and more solutions that are kind of in line with DACA, with what Dreamers have, or with other visas, kind of are more like standard, like like we can let's like lower, let's put some assumptions on the table so each person doesn't have to reprove every single thing from scratch, and kind of lower the bar of what it takes to win an asylum case. Because a lot of the reason there's such a huge backlog and it's taking so long is that the process has become so complicated that everyone is a loser. Everyone's a loser when it takes this many government resources to decide whether or not someone is an asylum seeker, in terms of like a judge, opposing counsel, the lawyer for this asylum seeker, the asylum seeker themselves, their family members, country conditions experts, psychologists, etc. Like we can fix that we can make it so it doesn't take the coordination of quite so many people giving quite so many labor hours in order to decide an asylum case. When someone has a death certificate showing that multiple members of their family have been killed, like how much more evidence do we need of the fact that someone is correctly fleeing, is legitimately fleeing danger and violence? I think there are a lot of ways to improve the system like that.
Like a framework based on the patterns that's responsive to the moment. And are you seeing efforts that are already starting, or what are some of the, maybe the first couple of things that could get efforts started in this direction?
I mean, there have been really incredible efforts outside of the asylum space, organized efforts. I mean, the Dreamers are like a epic example of a set of people organizing and then advocating a solution. I know that they're still fighting for a lot more and not satisfied with where they are yet, but like that they've made an enormous amount of progress that has a huge practical impact for so many people. That is exactly the kind of situation that asylum seekers could now be kind of organizing and moving towards. I think nationalities have done the same thing. There are kind of temporary protected status protections for different, for countries that have experienced natural disaster or extreme war. And so this is a space that I think asylum seekers could really follow the lead of so many other organized communities in articulating kind of easier, yeah.
And for ASAP specifically, are there a couple of policy priorities?
Sure. I mean, for ASAP specifically, our members have articulated the ability to work legal in the United States when there is no functional safety net is a high priority for our members. The ability to participate in proceedings kind of inaccessible ways, because right now asylum seekers are often required to travel like hundreds of miles for a 30-second hearing. So fixing that so people aren't getting deportation orders for like logistical reasons instead of like substantive reasons is another major priority of ours. Wrongful deportation orders in general, huge numbers of asylum seekers get ordered deported for reasons that are like no non-immigration lawyer would have understood how to follow the system and avoid that deportation order. So having some kind of redress, some way to fix the fact that a bunch of people have gotten deportation orders that didn't deserve them. And I think we can all agree things have not been going very legitimately in the last, I would hope that a lot of people can agree that things haven't been going very legitimately. So redress, fixing what's gone wrong for those asylum seekers in the last few years, and then family separation related priorities. We are working with hundreds of families who are separated as a result of the zero tolerance policies, and helping them to hold the government to account and making sure that this doesn't happen again, and redress for those families. Those are 4 of our biggest policy priorities right now as articulated by our members.
So there's the mindset shift piece that we've talked about earlier, and then very specific policy priorities. I'm going to pause. There are so many questions I want to highlight. A couple of things. One, Alain is on this call, and he is sharing that his wife and he were able to obtain our EAD cards, which is the employment authorization documents, with the help of ASAP, and are grateful for the support you provide for asylum seekers. I want to flag that and share that with you.
Thank you for sharing that. It's nice to
there's a lot of really great questions we're going to try and run through super quickly. Catherine is asking, you have aspirations to be international, and however the laws are so very different, constantly changing, legally speaking, but also in the actual application, I think. So the laws are different, and then the enforcement and implementation of the laws is different. And how can you address this? And Catherine is...
We don't have plans right now to be international until we have at least the capacity to serve all of the asylum seekers who are trying to engage in the US system. For now, I think it would be a next stage after that, but we're really deeply enmeshed in trying to make sure like the US borders are functionally welcoming asylum seekers before we take on more. So.
We are at 1:30. We have a whole series of other questions, and if Swapna, you're here for another couple of minutes, we can go over, and those that are able to
field a couple more.
Great. And so let's take a couple more questions. Kenny's asking, I'd also love to hear your opinion about the move away from commitments to receive asylum seekers in countries around the world, especially in the US and Europe. Do you anticipate this as something that's permanent? And what are the consequences that you're already starting to see?
Yeah, this is one of those areas where asylum seekers and refugees, commitments to receive refugees and asylum seekers are, at a historic low right now. I do have a lot of hope that those numbers will get much higher, at least in the US specifically, in the next couple of years. I think they should have always been much higher than they ever have been at a historic high. And I think at the end of the day, it just really comes down to like, sometimes I feel like there's a sense that there are sending countries and receiving countries, but I think that's like a short-sighted view of the world. I actually think like every country is likely to be a sending and receiving country depending on like what's happening in the world, climate change issues, unexpected war, technological development, who could know? I think the core is like trying to build a country that has policies where if the roles were shifted, you would be like, if there is a world in which people from the United States need to be massively fleeing the United States because of wildfires, because of some other kind of issue, that you would be happy if another country had the same kind of rules that you had. And I think that that's kind of, I think the core of all of this is that I think sometimes countries are taking the short view by restricting things, because I think there will likely be a time when all of us need to rely on each other. And just because that's not the case now doesn't mean that's how the policy should be designed.
And here's a question related, and you mentioned sort of working and that you already started engaging, for example, specifically in Mexico. Are you seeing efforts, and being that there's a lot of domestic situations around violence, around climate issues, are you seeing effort for a stronger collaboration from the US with countries of origin of asylum seekers? And what do you think is the role for both the US and the countries of origin on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think if any country's goal is to have fewer people seeking asylum in their country, an effective policy consideration is like whether that you as a country are contributing to the cause that's making people have to flee to your country, and then trying to fix that policy solution. So there are a lot, that policy problem, there are a lot of proposals on the table. For instance, there have been a lot of Central American asylum seekers who've come to the United States in recent years, and there are a lot of proposals that would actually try to fix issues in Central America that are causing people to come to the United States that are US created issues. For instance, there is a gang in Central America that is causing tens of thousands of people to flee the Northern Triangle countries in Central America. And that gang is named after a street in the United States because it is a US produced gang that was then deported back to those countries, that has now taken over entire states, like governments in the region. And so like, we couldn't be much more literally, the United States could not have much more literally caused issues there, and could not be much more responsible to fix the issue. So I do think there are people who know far more than me trying to address regional issues that are causing some of the inflows into the United States. And I have hope that some of those policy proposals will actually be used in the coming years because at the end of the day, a lot of our members didn't want, it's not like they just wanted to be in the United States. They just like want their kids to be safe. They've had relatives murdered. They've been the victims of sexual violence. Like they just need a place to live. And I think a lot of people would prefer to stay in the country they started in if that was an option where they had started.
We are over time. I do want to sort of ask you this as we've gone through this really rapid conversation. Is there anything else that you wanted to highlight, an invitation to volunteer, or anything you want to share with the listeners?
Sure. I think that the main thing I think it would be useful to communicate is just sometimes when things are getting worse is when they're in the news, but when things need to be rebuilt, it's kind of not the biggest media story. And I just would encourage everybody who has been following the issue of asylum seekers, has been following the fact that there are tent camps at the border, the fact that families have been separated, like continues to engage in that issue in the next administration, because we might finally have a chance to do right by these families and to fix what's gone wrong, but that will take everyone staying engaged and continuing to be committed to solving the problem, even after kind of like the news stories have gone down. So sometimes I tell people kind of in response to a news story that horrifies you, like create a Google Calendar reminder to re-engage in that issue in like 1 year or 2 years from that time, because there are times when we all feel called to action, and that's not necessarily the same time we can act in a useful way. And so just like a call to people that like, if there are opportunities to act, bills that could be passed, protests that could be joined related to these issues in the coming years, like think about joining them, even if it's not the front page issue of the United States.
And that's a really important reminder, because this is about continuing an effort over time, and change takes time. So thank you for reminding us. We are over. We could go on. There are a lot of questions, and what we'll try and do is send them over to Swapna and see if we can help you find an answer. We hope you enjoyed this, and thank you so much, Swapna, to take out time to join. Time is extra valuable for everyone, and especially with what's going on with ASAP right now. So thank you for joining. Thank you to everybody for listening, asking great questions. It is our privilege to find and support fellows like Swapna who are doing this work that's so important, and creating communities where we can all thrive. So have a safe holiday season, everyone, and thanks again, and stay tuned for our next conversation. We'll be in touch with that information.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining, especially to the member comment. That was really wonderful to hear. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.